Thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming to listen to me talk about public-private partnerships. Can you all hear me at the back? Yes? Okay, wonderful. So I'm the Associate Dean International from the Faculty of Business, Law and Politics. And we've had a number of your students come to us. We've got 2 with us this year at undergraduate level doing their final year. And the students who've come from UDM have always been really, really good students, high achieving students. So we're always very pleased for you to join us in Hull. My research area is based on a lot of private experience. So I've worked as an accountant for probably about 35 years, and I've worked as an accountant in government and worked with ministers who've been responsible for public-private partnerships in the UK, helping to advise them on what kind of policy the government should adopt. So that was my early career before I came into academia. This was my job all the way through being a young accountant running various different audit teams. So I have a lot of both professional experience and academic experience in this area. And public-private partnerships are always a contentious area because it involves the use of private sector money to deliver public sector projects. And as a result, people often have conflicting views about public-private partnerships. Wherever there's a profit motive involved for the private sector, so the private sector is trying to make a profit from investing in these projects, whilst at the same time the government is trying to achieve a social good. So you've got a big election coming up in April. These public-private partnerships have been discussed throughout that election because they're seen as a way of improving the infrastructure in Indonesia, just as they have been used to improve the infrastructure around the world. But wherever they're involved, there are always questions about where the private sector money comes from and how it's used to benefit the public, to benefit society. And you're at the very beginning of that journey. Although in Indonesia, public-private partnerships have been around since about 1998, really it's only since about 2005 that they've been an accepted part of government policy. So they haven't really been in your consciousness as long as they have been in say Australia and in the UK, where we've been using them for an awful long time. So I'll tell you first a little bit about public-private partnerships in the UK and the journey that the UK went on to get to where we are now in terms of infrastructure investment. And it started with compulsory competitive tendering policy in between 1979 and 1997, where the UK government forced the public sector to stop borrowing money itself to build things like hospitals and schools, and started saying to the public sector, you've got to bring money in from the private sector. And that was a conscious decision of a Conservative Party. So do you know about the Conservative Party in the UK? Theresa May, have you all heard of Theresa May? Yeah? Well, Theresa May is like Margaret Thatcher, and it was Margaret Thatcher that brought all these in. So Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher are very similar politicians, both from the Conservative Party, both believe that the private sector should help to drive and generate investment in the public sector. And so we had a range of policies from 1979 that said the public sector doesn't know how to do this. The public sector isn't very good at investing in its own projects. They're always behind on time. The government never works quickly enough. The government can't borrow money at the right price. And all of these kind of things led to the use of the Private Finance Initiative. And the Private Finance Initiative was what's happening here in Indonesia now, where private sector investors started to invest in the public sector as a way of developing infrastructure projects like hospitals and schools. And ever since then, ever since probably about 1985, there's been a lot of academics writing about this, both in the UK, in Australia, in America, all giving different opinions about whether or not public-private partnerships are a good idea and whether or not they actually deliver value for money for the public, for you, members of society, for people who pay taxes. And I've got my own view as an academic, but also as a personal, my own personal opinion as an accountant and as a person. And there are lots and lots of both positives and negatives to them. And it depends how they're done as to whether or not they're actually successful and whether or not they are useful to society. And more recently in the UK, the academics who have said they're not really that good an idea, they don't actually deliver that great value for money for the public that the government has always said that they do, these academics are now arguing for a more collaborative approach, and we call that a networked governance approach, where the public sector and the private sector don't just join in a partnership to invest in a project, but actually work more closely together and more collaborative together with the aim of doing something good for society. So it's it's evolved. The process of doing this has evolved over a long period of time. And when I was doing the research for this topic today, reading about PPPs in Indonesia, to me it looks like you're at the very beginning of that journey that started for us in about 1990, I would say. You're really on the start of that journey. So as Dean Echo just said about the MTR, ours came 150 years ago. It's the same with public-private partnerships. We started this about 30 years ago, and you're just about starting that process. And what I really hope is people who listen to these talks and who read these papers learn some of the lessons that we in the UK and in Australia have learned along that journey, because we've learned a lot of hard lessons along the way. And what I would hate is for you to follow this process and go through and have to learn all those experiences all over again, because you should learn from the things we've encountered and the things that we've done. Often in the UK, we follow America blindly. We would follow America over a cliff if they asked us to. And that's really sad, because we don't learn from America's hard lessons, and we just accept that what they've done is good and then follow them, and that's never a good approach. It's always best to take a considered approach and to learn from other people's mistakes. So I do hope that we can do that. So as I say, we started this journey quite a long time ago, over 30 years ago, with a fundamental shift from the public sector delivering everything to the private sector becoming involved, because the private sector were deemed to be better at it. They were deemed to be better at doing things more quickly, more efficiently, and at a cheaper price. And we call that the move to market-based public sector service delivery. And it means that the market, i.e. the private sector, deliver goods and services on behalf of the public sector. And in the UK, that really meant for a long time, if you wanted to build a hospital, or you wanted to build a school, or you wanted to build a road, the only way that you could do that was through a public-private partnership. The only way was to get the private sector to invest the money in that school or hospital and build it on behalf of the public sector. Basically, Margaret Thatcher and subsequent governments, including Labour governments, said the public sector is not allowed to do it on their own. They're not allowed to build anything on their own because they're not good enough at it. Therefore, we need to involve the private sector. And that led to a massive increase in the provision of public-private partnership funded infrastructure projects. Because just like you, we are also significantly expanding, doubling the number of our aged population by 2035, and all of those old people and young people who need an education or need to be looked after in hospital all need somewhere for that to happen. They all need a hospital or a school. And so somehow these hospitals and schools have got to be built. But at the same time, in the UK, as is the case in many countries, as was just being mentioned now, budgets are dropping massively. And in the UK public sector, the amount of money available for the government and local government to spend has been cut by at least 30% over the past 5 years. So at the same time as the population is rising, at the same time as the population is getting older and needing more care and getting more ill, the amount of money we spend on that population is dramatically falling. And something has to change, because while ever you're cutting spending, but your population is expanding and the country is in more need, somehow that money has to come from somewhere. And up till now, the money has always come from the private sector. So the government has insisted on more and more efficiency, more and more people doing less, doing more for less money, but also at the same time borrowing money. And where do they borrow that money from? Well, there are only so many, there's only so much available to borrow at low public sector rates. The rest has to come from banks or from, as is the case with the UK, Europe. And something people are always asking me is, Brexit, what does that mean for the UK? Well, to be honest, it doesn't mean a great deal, certainly for us yet in Hull. But it does mean something for these public sector projects, because these public sector projects have traditionally been funded by European funding. And what we don't know is how that European funding is going to change following Brexit. My guess is the cost of borrowing, the interest rates from Europe, will rise. And as a result, as those interest rates rise, these projects that have been funded through European funding will suddenly become a lot more expensive. And when they become more expensive, what is the government going to do? And I've never seen a plan. I've not to date seen a plan about what the government is going to do following Brexit if the cost of borrowing from Europe and the cost of cheap subsidised loans changes. And that's quite a worry for an accountant. So many countries have been using public-private partnerships for a long time as a way of funding public sector infrastructure. According to the CBI, the government in the UK spends a huge amount of money, 187 billion a year, almost 30% of total public sector spending, with private sector companies. That's a lot of money for the private sector to fund of public sector services. And it varies according to the type of spending. So local government, which includes refuse collection, it includes local roads and housing for old people, spends 84 billion of that amount of money. Central government spends 40 billion and the NHS spends 50 billion. And again, I don't know how much you've read about the NHS in the UK, but the NHS in the UK is struggling. It's really, really struggling. I read a report yesterday by a chief consultant in the NHS who said that from his perspective, our ability as a nation to provide healthcare services free at the point of delivery, which is a tradition that's happened in the UK for 100 years, well, nearly 100 years, is likely to stop soon because we just can't afford to carry on doing it. And the health service is on its knees. And there's an example of a public-private partnership where I live. So I live in a place called Huddersfield, which is not that far from Manchester and Leeds. And right next to Huddersfield is another town called Halifax. And Huddersfield and Halifax both have a hospital because they're big towns. Huddersfield is the biggest town in the UK. And both towns have a hospital, and one of the hospitals has been funded by the NHS, traditional public sector funding. It's an old-fashioned hospital. It was bought by the public sector, it's run by the public sector, and there is no private sector involvement. So that's the hospital in Huddersfield. The hospital in Halifax is a public-private partnership hospital. So it was built by the private sector, it was built using private sector money, and it's now leased back to the public sector for it to offer health services in that town. And that, to me, crystallises this debate about public-private partnerships versus public sector delivery. The hospital in Halifax, the public-private partnership hospital, now costs so much money, the lease costs so much money to the public sector, that the hospital in Huddersfield is going to have to close. So there's a big debate in society where I live at the moment about the closure of this hospital in my town. My town is the biggest town in the UK. The town next to it is much, much smaller. But because of public-private partnerships, my hospital, the Huddersfield Hospital, is going to have to close, or at least radically change, because the health service can no longer afford to keep paying for that public-private partnership hospital and keep the other hospital open. And this is one of the problems about public-private partnerships, which I'll try to explain over the next few slides. So, I won't talk to you about CCT, because CCT happened quite a long time ago, but the Private Finance Initiative simply means the way in which we fund public-private partnerships, the borrowing of money for public-private partnerships. And it's still very, very popular in the UK. Most PFI projects relate to a service that's delivered by the public sector, like a hospital, and is funded by the private sector in some form. And often when you see the word PPP, academics use that term synonymously with PFI. So the terms are often used interchangeably. They shouldn't be. A PPP is a form of private finance initiative. Private finance initiative simply means the use of private sector money for public sector services. But up until our financial crisis in 2008, most PFI projects were a combination of 10 to 15% share capital, private sector share capital funded, and 85 to 90% borrowing from the bank. That's a huge amount of money to borrow from the bank. If you were buying a house and you borrowed 90% of the value of the house from the bank, you'd be paying a lot of interest back, wouldn't you? Every month you'd have to pay a lot of interest back to the bank, because almost all of that money for that house had been borrowed. It's the same in the public sector. The public sector borrows a huge amount of money to fund something. It's going to be expensive. It's going to have to pay that money back. But also it has another complicating factor. When it borrows money from the private sector, it also has to cover the profit of the private sector. So not only is it covering the interest costs and the costs of setting up the scheme and the costs of working with the private sector provider, it's also covering the profit of the private sector. And therein lies a lot of the problems with PPPs. But the way in which PPPs were sold to the UK public and to the Australian public and the American public was that, yes, we know it's going to be expensive to pay back that interest. Yes, we know it's going to be expensive to cover that profit and that private sector, but it's going to be offset by the fact that the private sector is way better at delivering things than the public sector. That basically at the heart of PPPs, the concept is that because the private sector is so much more efficient and so much better than the public sector, so much quicker and faster, better at delivering things, then it will work. So, it'll be fine, it'll all work. And there's a lot of debate about that in academia. So if you read about public-private partnerships, a lot of it centres around something called the anticipated risk transfer. And that means the transfer of the risk of the project failing moves from the public sector to the private sector. And because that risk transfers, the public sector is better off. So there's lots of debate around that. It's quite complicated. There are lots of calculations about how that works. And this has been ongoing, this debate in academia now for probably about 15 years, about the extent to which that risk transfer justifies the use of private sector money for public sector infrastructure. And they say that the value for money that accrues from involving the private sector is so good that it's definitely worth going ahead with public-private partnerships. And these public-private partnerships are these combinations of maybe government body, maybe the private sector investment company, maybe McKinsey or some other kind of investment company, maybe a charity or a healthcare provider if it's a hospital, or an educational charity if it's a school, and maybe some kind of advisory body, a quango in the UK. And these all feed into what we call significant partnerships. And significant partnerships are those partnerships that are created to deliver the public-private partnership ethos. And again, in the academic journals, there's lots and lots of explanations of different types of public-private partnership, because there are all sorts of different ways of doing this. But at its very heart, mostly what it means is the public and private sector come together to generate the funds to build an infrastructure project, perhaps a hospital. So they come together and they build this brand new hospital, and then the private sector rents or leases that hospital back to the public sector for a period of time, usually for something between 20 to about 80 years, more typically 20 to 40 years. So in the case of these two hospitals, the one in Huddersfield and the one in Halifax, the one in Huddersfield was built in the 1960s. The public sector borrowed money very cheaply from the public sector funding body, as it was at the time. That hospital was paid for and is now owned by the health service about 20 years ago. So we now own this big hospital, lots and lots of land. It's not a fancy hospital, it's not got the best, most cutting operating theatres, but it's there and it's owned by the health service. The one in Halifax will not be owned by the health service for at least another 20 to 30 years. We are borrowing it, we're renting it. So it's almost like you as an individual buying a house, but not actually buying it, just renting it from someone until you get to the end of a lease period. And then by the end of that lease period, you can either take the lease outright or you can start all over again. And that's what we call a design, build, finance and operate, a DBFO, public-private partnership. The consortium, the public sector and the private sector, choose what project to undertake, co-design it to the specification of the public sector, then go ahead and build it using this consortium's money, then finance it using private sector finance, probably an 80-85% loan, and then the private sector lease it to the public sector, and the public sector then deliver services through that hospital or that school. And that's the most common type. But there are other types. So there's build, operate, transfer, where the ownership of the project, the infrastructure transfers immediately to the public sector or transfers after a period of time. There's a build, own, operate, where the public sector always owns the asset but just uses private sector money to fund it. And then there are other types, but most of them in the UK are DBFOs. And what I've looked at here in Indonesia, most of them are DBFOs in Indonesia as well. So what are the benefits? Well, the benefits to the public sector are claimed to be numerous by academics. So it's this concept of the transfer of risk. We transfer risk to the private sector, that justifies using private sector investment because the private sector is so much quicker and better at doing things. The private sector do unarguably have more skills in terms of project design. There are better architects, there are more specialist skills for these kind of projects. There's no question about that. The private sector do have a lot of skills. Studies have shown that private sector projects tend to be delivered quicker, with less cost overrun, usually more on time than a public sector project, certainly in the UK. Private sector, there's a bigger imperative on delivering things quickly. There are also more skills in contracting in the private sector, which lend more efficiency into the process. And very crucially, when I first started working on these PPPs, they were off-balance sheet financing. It was a way of the government not showing their borrowing on the government's balance sheet. So these big public-private partnership funded infrastructure projects were not on the UK government's balance sheet. So it looked like the UK government didn't owe any money, or it didn't owe as much money as it clearly did owe. And have you all heard of Gordon Brown? Gordon Brown was one of our Chancellors of the Exchequer. He was known as the off-balance sheet financing Chancellor of the Exchequer because this was his favourite method of keeping borrowing costs off the UK's balance sheet. Now that has changed, and many of these projects are now on the UK government's balance sheet. But crucially, the UK government's balance sheet has never, ever been signed off by the UK government auditor. So you know how companies have to have their accounts signed off every year. These accounts present a true and fair view of the position and performance of this company. The UK government's accounts have never been signed off, ever. So there are lots of questions about how much this borrowing does actually show on the government's balance sheet. Because after a long period of time of it not being on the balance sheet, it's very difficult to make sure it all gets on the balance sheet. This isn't the only reason the accounts have not been signed off, but it is one of them. And what are the benefits to the private sector? Well, the biggest benefit is profit. And also making sure that the private sector delivers in terms of jobs for citizens in society. So there are lots of benefits for the private sector, and even today the private sector continues to argue vociferously that these projects are the best way of financing infrastructure. The disadvantages, to be honest, are numerous. There are lots of disadvantages. There are lots of uncertainties about them. And there is a big debate raging in academia about them, with people very strongly on one side or another. People can get very angry about this. You know, I've been to conferences where academics have literally been arguing with each other about whether or not they work and whether or not they're a good idea. But most of the arguments are around this idea of risk transfer and value for money. Does it actually provide value for money for society? How accountable is the government being in terms of what it does with these private sector funders? And the profits are always a concern. Failure to negotiate the contracts properly does result in higher costs for the public sector. And I only read yesterday that one of the difficulties of PPPs in Indonesia is that your government doesn't have the skills to negotiate private sector contracts with the private sector. That's definitely one of the disadvantages across the world. The public sector isn't prepared, isn't set up for dealing with huge companies who do this on a daily basis, who argue about profits and contracts on a daily basis. So there are lots of difficulties, disadvantages. And I think this is one of the biggest ones, that the fact that you're entering into a 20 to 80 year agreement with a private sector provider to deliver a public sector service, that's a long time. How much do we know about what's going to happen to society in 10 years? How much do we know about what's going to happen to society in the next 6 months? You've got an election in April. You don't know what will happen. We don't know what's going to happen with Brexit. Anything could happen. And if you're locked into a 20 to 80 year agreement with a private sector provider, that's a long time. And lots of things change. And the private sector providers, certainly in the UK, have been very, very good at locking the public sector into contracts that are not always beneficial. So, for example, some of the hospital contracts, after 20 years, the public sector is being charged £20 for a £1 light bulb because of the way that the contract has been set up in the future to rise with inflation or to rise in a certain way, and the public sector hasn't had the skills to negotiate that contract at the beginning. So a lot of the problems arise from the long-term nature of these agreements and the fact that the public sector doesn't have the skills to negotiate the contracts. And to be honest, that's the heart of the problem. There is a lot of self-interest in these projects. The private sector has a lot of interest in these projects because, yes, they benefit society. Building a school or a hospital is a benefit to society, but if it involves delivering a profit to the private sector, that creates a problem. That's the problem statement, and it's called goal incongruence. The private sector has got the need to meet society's needs, which constantly change, which constantly evolve, and the private sector, really all it cares about is profit and about adding value for its shareholders. And those two goals put together in one project are not congruent, they're not fluid. And that's where we say those public-private partnerships have got a goal incongruence. They meet in the middle of that. It's not a good place to be. There are a huge amount of academic studies, huge amount. This is just some of them. About the VFM and risk, that's one concept that's discussed as a stream of literature in the academic accounting journals. Another one is about governance and accountability, the on-off balance sheet nature of it, how accountable is the private sector, can the private sector deliver a public sector project, and then the audit of them. Is the public sector able to properly audit these projects? Does it have the skills to properly audit it? So given all of this, there's been a development in the literature towards a more collaborative set of more collaborative way of working. And it started really with this idea of social capital research by Eridge and Green in the early 2000s, and has led on to the idea of networked governance and of collaborative delivery, collaborative provision, rather than this concept of just purely a public-private partnership. And I would say that collaborative provision has improved things in the UK in terms of public-private partnership. The private sector and the public sector have become better at working with each other. They've become more understanding of each other's goals and aims. Nevertheless, we're still left with this idea that stakeholders, the people who these public-private partnerships are there to meet the needs of, don't always have a very strong say in what goes on. It's difficult for them because when it's a contractual relationship, it's not easy for, I don't know, the old lady who's in the Halifax hospital having a knee or a hip operation. It's hard for her to have a say in how that hospital is run, especially when it's being governed tightly by a long-term financial contract. So although things have got better, although we've moved towards this new idea of networked relationship, collaborative provision, networked governance, things have got better. Less of the public-private partnerships are off balance sheet, which makes them more transparent and more accountable. Things are still not great. They're still not perfect. So the European Commission has been involved over the past sort of 10 to 15 years and has said quite clearly, you must move towards this more collaborative provision idea, rather than being just a purely the public and private sector get together to deliver these projects. There has to be a more cooperative approach to reducing costs. And whereas 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, the contracts that were set up were very, very much in favour of the private sector making a big profit, the contracts have got better. So they're less about the private sector making a huge profit and more about how the two parties can get together to meet society's needs. And if there is a lesson that I would say that needs to be learnt in developing countries before you begin down this road, it's to try and have this as the principle rather than what we had 40 years ago, which was very much based on what was good for the private sector. So yes, PPPs can be a good thing. They can massively change the country. In the UK, we've got a huge range of roads, hospitals, schools that have all been built just because of public-private partnerships. And certainly in Asian countries, transport networks have improved significantly because of these public-private partnerships. In Jakarta, it still takes 5 hours to get from one place to another in what should take half an hour, but it's getting better, and it's getting better because of these projects. But, do bear in mind that they also have a cost. How many toll roads do you go on where you've got to actually pay at the point of delivery? And on a big toll road, you stop and you hand over your card or swipe your card, give them the money. That's probably because it's been built using a PPP. So you're handing over your money to fund this infrastructure project. Yes, it happens, and traffic is eased, congestion is eased, and that's a good thing, but you're paying for it. You're just paying for it in a slightly different way. And yes, that movement of transport, the logistical movement of the supply chain around the country, if that improves, that brings with it huge fiscal benefits for the country. Because if I can get here to Jogja in half the time it would normally take me because of a public-private partnership, then that's meant that I can come here twice as often and I can deliver benefits by being here. Similarly, if companies in Jogja want to sell products in the UK and they can get to the UK in half the time, that makes that company a lot more profitable. So although, yes, on paper there are costs of the public-private partnership, there are wider benefits to society that we don't always see, which is why governments are keen on these projects, and understandably so. So many countries in the ASEAN region have massively developed their GDP, and I would say some of that is down to the fact that they've invested into their infrastructure through public-private partnerships. And infrastructure is vital, because it causes so many blocks to the supply chain. If you don't improve your infrastructure, your supply chain doesn't improve, you are not productive as a country. You're competing with China, you're competing with Vietnam, you're competing with Thailand. Those countries are investing a lot of money in infrastructure. If you don't invest money in infrastructure, you won't be able to compete. That's the problem. And that's the difficulty your government has. It knows that it needs to invest in infrastructure. It needs to do it for society's benefit. It needs to do it to increase productivity and profitability. But how does it go about doing it? How does it actually translate that into action? So I'll talk to you a little bit about the use of PPPs in Indonesia. So how do we address your infrastructure problems using PPPs? Well, PPPs have been around in Indonesia for a long time, since 1998, but were really only brought into your legal consciousness as a country in around 2005. And you know, they are debated every time there's a presidential campaign. If you go onto Google now or go onto the news and you search for PPPs in Indonesia, you'll find a huge range of debates that take place between politicians about this very issue. It will be being debated today somewhere by politicians in Indonesia. How should we do it? What should we do? How much should we invest? Where are we going to get the money from? How are we going to deal with it going forward? That happens every day. So all candidates pledge to improve infrastructure. If you look at the current president and the other presidential candidates, they will all be, one of their key pledges will be, we will improve Indonesia's infrastructure. We will make Indonesia more competitive, more cost-effective, more efficient. And one of the ways it can do that is through these public-private partnerships. And McKinsey say that public-private partnerships in Indonesia offer a £180 billion opportunity if they only meet 30% of Indonesia's infrastructure needs. That's a massive amount of money. $180 billion if it only meets 30% of your infrastructure needs. That's a lot of money. That's a big, big chunk of the economy. So whether or not you get this right really matters. If you don't get this right, then your productivity in comparison to China or Vietnam or Thailand will plummet. So you will find, if you haven't already heard about this, over the next 10 years, this becomes a much more widely debated issue in Parliament, because it's your way of solving that infrastructure crisis that you have. There's no question, you are a massive nation, you've got a lot of islands, you've got a lot of people. If you can get it together, if you can get your infrastructure working in the same way as China does, you will be a massive economic powerhouse. And that's what the politicians are wrestling with at the moment. So, yes, PPPs have developed over the last sort of 20 years here in Indonesia. A recent World Bank report says Indonesia has lost about 1% of economic growth every year because it hasn't invested enough in this, because it hasn't invested enough in its infrastructure. And that has to change. So there are a number of reasons why the use of PPPs and private sector finance in Indonesia hasn't been as successful as previous presidents would have liked. And one of them is that the private sector doesn't trust the public sector in Indonesia. There is a level of distrust between the two, because it feels that it won't be able to work in the same way as the public-private partnerships perhaps do in the UK or Australia. And so it's not prepared to invest the level of funds that's needed, that 180 billion that's needed, just to meet 30% of your infrastructure requirements, because it isn't sure how it's going to work out. It's not sure how public-private partnerships are going to work in Indonesia. You've also had problems with land acquisition. I know that your current president, that's a big part of his campaign, talking about land acquisition. It's a very sensitive topic because it's your president wants to widen the ownership of land throughout Indonesia, and that's a very laudable social aim. It's really crucial that people become landowners and become invested in the future of Indonesia. But as a result, the availability of land for these infrastructure projects, it's not always as straightforward as it might be in another country. So in 2012, the previous president introduced the Land Acquisition Act. That did make things a little bit easier. to amend the land clearing process, but it's still not straightforward. It's not as straightforward as it needs to be for it to work. During the previous administration, the government very, very prominently said PPPs were the answer to Indonesia's infrastructure problem. It made that very, very clear. The difficulty has been that since then, since 2004, the amount of investment that's been needed hasn't happened. So there's been lots of projects started that haven't completed. There's been lots of projects that need investment that haven't had that investment. There've been regulatory problems, and also your legal structure is very complicated for public-private partnerships. In the UK, it's very straightforward. It's a clear partnership between the partner of the private sector side, the investment companies, and the partners at the public sector side. And setting one up is quite straightforward. In Indonesia, it's not so straightforward. Nevertheless, Indonesia was second after China in 2017 for attracting private funds to these infrastructure projects. You're a massive country. You know, it stands to sense that you and China need the most investment, and you're getting it. So now it's what you do with it to make that work, to create that future for Indonesia. You attracted 15.4 billion to 11 projects, but bear in mind we said you needed 180 billion to fund 30% of the infrastructure needs. So although that sounds like a lot of money, it isn't. You're still not attracting as much money as you need. So the President is going to have to generate more investment from private sector investors in Indonesia and continue to work with the World Bank and other providers, just like the UK works with the EU, just like America works with various IMF and global funds to get funding. You'll have to do the same here in Indonesia. Your Dean was talking about the MTR. You've got a Jakarta to Bandung high-speed railway funded through a public-private partnership, through a consortium of Indonesian countries and Chinese state-owned corporations. And that will be another issue that you face going forwards. You know, I talked about those two hospitals, one in Huddersfield, one in Halifax, the one in Huddersfield having to close. When these projects are funded by other countries, you know, that brings with it risks of its own. The other countries then have a stake in your future. So you have to enter into these agreements with your eyes wide open, knowing that you're opening up your infrastructure to other people. You know, it isn't just the government that's funding these projects. So just very quickly, a couple of projects. The Batang Power Plant project is a PPP set to become operational by 2020. Do you remember I said a DBFO, Design, Build, Finance, Operate scheme? That's a DBFO. That has a 25-year lease. So the funding has been provided on a 25-year lease. The government will pay for it over 25 years, and then it will probably revert to public sector ownership. Another scheme is the Palapa Ring project, which is 3 projects together, designed to create infrastructure in IT, broadband services. So you can see that you're starting to create these big projects. It's about what you do going forward. And the Palapa Ring project was the first PPP project in Indonesia's telecommunications sector, using a new scheme that was introduced by your finance ministry. And that was a really good step forward. There are funds now created under the Universal Service Obligation Scheme available to public sector organisations to fund infrastructure in Indonesia. That's been a huge step forward. To be honest, most of the infrastructure projects in Indonesia, like in many developing countries, are toll road projects. Almost every toll road in Indonesia will have been funded through some form of public-private partnership. But to some some extent, a lot of your toll road schemes can't really be called public-private partnerships because they don't involve private sector investment. And that's the biggest difficulty for Indonesia, convincing private sector investors that they should enter into partnerships with the Indonesian government to deliver these infrastructure projects. And land acquisition still remains very, very sensitive. President Jokowi has been keen to demonstrate that land reform is there to benefit the poor, and so the amount of land that can be released for public-private partnerships and infrastructure projects is still limited, and unless that changes, it's difficult for you to expand your infrastructure. So what do you need to do going forward? Well, I would say that you need to learn some of the lessons that we've encountered in the UK and Australia. You need to maybe get a very strong body in the government to drive forward public-private partnerships. When I was first dealing with public-private partnerships in the UK about 30 years ago, there was a very, very strong local government minister called Eric Pickles, who was a Conservative minister who championed these kind of arrangements. And he then became the local government minister, and he set up a huge body to drive forward public-private partnership funded infrastructure projects in the UK. And that made a massive difference, because if you've got a very strong character in the government behind it and a very strong body to drive it forward, then politically it becomes more achievable. And those people can then convince the private sector investors to invest their money, that it's going to be a wise investment. I would say that following the election, whoever is appointed, they should take this as being one of the key priorities, and I'm certain that they will. They're already talking about it. Infrastructure development in Indonesia is vital. You cannot move forward, you cannot become economically powerful until you've solved your infrastructure problems, or at least started to solve them and got agreement about how to solve them. And a recent healthcare event held by the World Bank in Indonesia last year in Jakarta, your Minister of Finance said more involvement of the private sector through PPPs will help timely project delivery and within budget estimations. Private sector participation will also broaden opportunities for innovation and technology. Do you remember what I said about the UK 30 years ago? And one of the main reasons that academics argue PPPs work is risk transfer, value for money, the development of skills in the public sector. Your finance minister is saying what our finance ministers were saying 30 years ago. And then the World Bank director for Indonesia kind of countered that a little bit and said, that's all fabulous, but there isn't a silver bullet. Now that means there isn't an easy answer. There isn't. PPPs are not an easy answer. They are a solution, and they bring with them a range of different advantages and disadvantages, but they're not the answer to every problem. They're not the answer to your infrastructure problems. They're a mechanism for changing things. And if they're used wisely, if they're used appropriately, and not there just to increase private sector profit, then yes, they can expand quality service delivery so that society benefits. But what you don't want is to end up like in the UK, where the hospital in the biggest town in the UK is closing or potentially closing because it can't afford to pay the public-private partnership bill for the hospital in the town next door. So go into it, do it, you need to do it, there's no question. Indonesia's infrastructure needs to be improved, but PPPs are only one way of doing that. They're not the only way. And so you need to go into it with your eyes open. So I've delivered in 2 minutes short of an hour, I think. I hope you found it interesting. I really do hope that this next election works out well and that you do move down this road of becoming this huge economic powerhouse that Indonesia deserves to be, and you've got such a great population of people that you deserve to rival China in terms of an economic powerhouse. So I hope that happens for you. Before I move on to that, does anybody have any questions about this?
All right, thank you for the opportunity, Ms. Barrow.
Thank you.
I would like to ask, earlier you said that government covering everything, including the private profit. True. Well, I did notice that you say the advantage of the PFI is the private can deliver quality and efficiency better than the public sector. Well, quality and efficiency are sometimes cannot be measured in a monetary terms. Then how come PFI is a more preferable if it's not significantly cheaper?
I personally don't believe that the private sector can always deliver things more efficiently or more effectively than the public sector. That's not my opinion. But that's one of the arguments that the government gave for introducing PPPs. So the government claimed 30 years ago that the private sector was better at delivering projects and on time and more efficiently. And there are academic studies that do demonstrate that the private sector can be better at delivering on time, and there are lots of reasons for that. The private sector often has more skills, and because it's driven by a profit motive, it wants to do things quicker because it makes more profit. The only way it makes profit is by doing things quickly and efficiently to turn a profit, and if it doesn't make a profit, it goes out of business. The public sector doesn't have that motive. The public sector traditionally is based upon meeting society's needs. So that's why some people argue that the private sector can do things more efficiently. But personally, I would say it isn't always true that that's the case, and I think over the last 30 years, the UK government, the Australian government have found that. And where the private sector hasn't delivered efficiently and effectively, the private sector company goes into liquidation, so it goes bankrupt, it closes, and then the public sector is left with the asset, the infrastructure, that it's then got to deal with because it still has to provide that service. So for example, in the case of, say, a road, a toll road, if a private sector company creates that toll road, builds the toll road, and then can't collect enough money from that toll to keep going, the private sector company will go bankrupt. What happens then? Does the road close? No. The government carries on doing it, and the government picks up the bill. And so although you might argue for all of these efficiency savings, at the end of the day, if the private sector fails, the public sector has still got to carry on delivering. And that's one of the biggest problems of PPPs. The public sector can't fail because the public sector has got to meet the needs of society. So I hope that answered your question.
May I ask a second question? Right. Yeah, it's about the profitability. So provision of facilities by PFI will only occur where it is profitable, right? And is there a way for government to conduct a PFI in a less developed region other than sharing the risk between the two?
I'm not sure what you mean, I'm sorry.
Some economic problems will include equity to build where it is less developed, right?
Yes.
And I know that it would bear more risk.
It just charges more.
Oh.
The company will just charge more.
But there will be a less social multiplier?
It will cost the government more. The multiplier, the social multiplier, will cost more, but it will still happen. So, the Indonesian government might decide to build something in Bandung, say, or in a much more remote region. The private sector may say, we're only prepared to work with you in that region and invest that money if you give us 5% more interest. So we'll work with you and we'll work in that region, but we're going to charge you a lot more. And then the public sector has then got to decide, can they do it cheaper themselves? Do they still want to go ahead? And do they pay the private sector that premium just to deliver in that region? So it's not a barrier, it just means it costs more.
Thank you, Ms. Barrow.
Thank you. I think there's a young lady there who's got a question.
Thank you. My name is Erika.
Hey, Erika.
So, what I would like to ask is, from my own perspective, I see that there is a common practice in Indonesia that many of our government staff who have the ability to negotiate with the private sector misuse this opportunity and try to make profit for their own by cooperating with the private sector and take their own share of the profit. So what is being done by the UK's government in order to reduce and discourage this practice? Thank you.
It's very difficult because that happens everywhere. It happens in society everywhere. There are always people who will subvert things for their own self-interest. In the UK, I would say about 40 years ago, they used to call it a brown envelope culture. I don't know if you call it here, where basically two people would meet in a pub or a restaurant and swap a brown envelope, and they would say, I agree to do that, provided you give me £20,000 for myself. And I can't say that doesn't still happen. It does, because that's life. Human beings are human beings, and there will always be people who care more about their own personal interests than about the interests of society. But the way in which the UK government tried to deal with that was to be very open about it and prosecute people. So we've had a lot of different prosecutions in the UK. Don't know, have you heard of the UK government expenses scandal? There was a big scandal about politicians claiming too much on their expenses. The way the government tries to deal with it is to bring things out into the open and then prosecute the person so that it puts other people off. But, you know, in reality, it still happens. It's difficult. To some extent, what you've got to be more concerned about is if you don't do it, what happens? So if you don't improve your infrastructure somehow, what's going to happen to Indonesia? And that's the first question that has to be asked. So you've got to find a way to improve the infrastructure first and then deal with the problems afterwards, I think. Recognise that self-interest is always going to be there, human beings are human beings, and then try to deal with that as best you can. And a lot of it comes down to the honour and integrity of the politicians involved. Thank you.
My name is Christopher. I am currently a researcher in public sector governance under Laboratory of Accounting. My interest is a public value, the paradigm in public management. I want to ask a concept. Besides public-private partnership, why do the governments do not use the co-creation concept? They give a permission to private sector to build the infrastructure, and they just control the process. They don't make a partnership, but they just like a new public management, like a market work. That's the first. The second one, I think the problem of accountability can be resolved. In accountability, there are two concepts like financial and performance. Nah, I think partnership bring a problem like what the output of for each the product, right? Nah, I think the horizontal accountability can can make it clear who should recognize the performance, what terms of the cost or the product. Nah, I think the horizontal can answer the problem of accountability of the public-private partnership. Thank you for me.
I would agree, definitely. There are solutions, there's no question. terms of co-creation, I would just call that capitalism. So co-creation to me is carry on doing what you've always done, let the private sector deliver services on behalf of the public sector, and the public sector pays for them. So I think often what we find in literature, we use new words for things that already exist. New public management is just a new word for managing the public sector using commercial principles. Co-creation to me is just another word for capitalism. If you mean collaborative provision, then yes, I think that that's a good step, because I think collaborative provision implies and should ensure that the public and private sector are equal stakeholders and work together for the benefit of society. And where that happens, then I think that really can work. And in the UK, over the past sort of 4 or 5 years, that's been the way things have been going. There's been an acceptance that what's gone on before has really been too heavily biased in favour of the private sector, and what we need going forward is something that redistributes that balance to make it more equal. In terms of the governance, yes, obviously if we're all equal, governance and accountability and transparency become much clearer. If we're all prepared to act as equal parties with an equal stake, then it's easier to make sure that good governance happens and that things are transparent. So coming back to that question about private self-interest, if we're all trying to work towards the same aim on the same level, all believing that we're equal and that the most important thing is to meet society's needs, then it becomes much easier to manage. It becomes much more transparent, much more governable. So there are lots of steps to improve accountability and governance, and that's what we call, well, what has been called in the UK literature, networked governance, where we create this network of interested parties, all with the same aim, hopefully in this case meet society's needs and social good, and as a result, as this network of interrelated stakeholders who are all equal, we work together to achieve that aim and thereby try to exclude private interest. So in an ideal world, that's exactly it, that's what we do. But sadly we don't live in an ideal world, and co-creation has the tendency to become capitalism by any other name, and networked governance is very difficult to achieve, because making sure everybody is equal is really tough. You know, we all know we all want to be more than equal. Even if we say we want to be equal, we all want to be number one. That's human nature. So achieving it is different to what we say we want to achieve. But certainly, yes, I do agree. I think there is the possibility for things to improve if we work in that way. Thank you.
Thank you.